and The Real Lincoln. Professor DiLorenzo is a columnist and blogger for LouRockwell.com and Mises.org, and is widely published in the popular press, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, Reader's Digest, and dozens of other newspapers and magazines. He has been interviewed on hundreds of radio talk shows, including The Rush Limbaugh Show, as well as CNN, C-SPAN, Fox, Business Channel, and MSNBC. In 2012, he was awarded the George W. Coulter Award for Writing in Defense of Liberty by the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He is Vice President of the Property and Freedom Society. Let's give Dr. DiLorenzo a warm welcome, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Marshall. I think that took up most of my time, I think. We don't have much time to do anything else. Well, thank you all for coming. The topic that I suggested to Professor DeRosa is, I guess this is Italian night at FAU, DiLorenzo, is why America needs more capitalism now more than ever. So I thought I'd start by asking the question, well, what is capitalism anyway? Because there's a lot of confusion about this. You know, one of the most famous books in economics, in the field of economics, is called The Wealth of Nations. It's actually called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. It was published in the year 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence. And basically, that's the question Adam Smith was asking. Well, what is capitalism, and is it good or bad for society? It's a big, fat book. If you were to go to Barnes & Noble and buy it, it's about this thick if they have it. And so you would never want to read it. So just listen to my lecture, and that's all you need to know, I guess. But that's the question he's asking, because at the time, there was sort of a mix, like in our time, there was a mixture of what I call real capitalism, just people engaging in commerce and free voluntary trade in the marketplace. But there was also what today we would call crony capitalism, of business people who get political connections that they use to get laws or regulations passed that create monopoly, special advantages, special privileges. And that's the thing that Adam Smith railed against in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. Back in those days, this was called mercantilism. It wasn't called crony capitalism. That's sort of a phrase that we use today. And so this is a very old question. So I'm going to offer you just a couple of very brief definitions from a couple of famous people. One is an economist named Murray Rothbard. He's passed away a few years ago, but he's a very prolific writer. He said this: free market capitalism is a network of free and voluntary exchanges in which producers produce and exchange their products for the products of others through prices voluntarily arrived at, period. That's what capitalism is. Another definition, a popular writer from yesteryear, Ayn Rand, she said this: capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. And one of the benefits of what we call capitalism, which was actually named by Karl Marx, the word capitalism was named by the man who wanted to destroy capitalism, Karl Marx. One of the benefits of it, and one of the things that Adam Smith himself recognized in this famous book written several hundred years ago, was that markets, the buying and selling of goods and services in competition in markets, harnesses human self-interest in ways that in most cases is good for all of society. Not in every single case, but in most cases it's good for society. In some of my classes, I teach in a business school at my university, and a lot of my students watch this television show, Shark Tank. Has anybody of you seen this show, Shark Tank? And one of the things you learn, it's kind of fun to watch. They have these billionaires sitting up at a table, and people of all ages, of all backgrounds come in, and they make a pitch. I've invented this business, I've started this business or this product, and they want investment. They're looking for investment money. But what drives this whole thing is every question that they ask is based on one thing: how likely is it that this new product or this new service that you're talking about is going to please your fellow man? How likely is it that a lot of people are going to like this product? because that's the only way really to make money in the free market, in real capitalism, is pleasing your fellow man. Adam Smith himself, this is what he said about it. He said, he defined capitalism in this way: give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want. That's a good example, I think, a good way of putting it to what goes on in this show, Shark Tank, and with any successful business. A friend of mine, Walter Williams, who's a nationally syndicated columnist, and he's a professor at George Mason University, he calls money certificates of performance. He says if you have money in your pocket, it's because somewhere along the line, if you earned that money, you helped your fellow man in some way. You did something. You participated in a team that works for, if you have a job at Chipotle, for example, you work with a team that pleases people, gives them good food to eat, except for when they had that salmonella scare, I guess, at Chipotle. Salmonella salad is no longer on the menu, I guess, over there. But you get the idea. A lot of college students probably have jobs or part-time jobs at places like this. But maybe you never thought about it, but you are serving your fellow man, and in return, they're giving you that which you want, money. Okay, and so there's a famous statement by Adam Smith about the harnessing of human self-interest. He said this: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their own interest, their own self-interest. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens." That's Adam Smith. And this reminds me of my friend Walter Williams that I mentioned. He was on a documentary once. There's a documentary by John Stossel, who used to be on the ABC television with Barbara Walters. And he went off and made a bunch of documentaries on economics. Stossel just studied up and learned some economics, and he made one called Greed. You can go on YouTube and watch Greed with John Stossel. And he interviews my old friend Walter, and they're talking about, they interviewed all these people involved in the delivery of steaks from a cattle ranch in Montana all the way to New York City. What does it take to do that? What does it take to get these steaks to New York City? And a momentous quote from Walter Williams was that, from this documentary, was that if the people in New York had to rely on human love and kindness to get their steaks, I doubt there'd be one cow in New York City, Walter said. Because what's driving these farmers to get up and work 12, 14, 16 hours a day in the wintertime, in the cold, and everybody else that's involved in that whole business of delivering food to market is not love of their fellow man, but love of themselves and raising their families, sending their kids to school, doing what everybody else does. And that was Adam Smith's insight, that as long as we have the rule of law and the respect for private property, that in society, then this pursuit of money, this pursuit of self-interest benefits the whole society. That's why the Wealth of Nations, this book, became so famous down to this day. It also explains another aspect of capitalism is the international division of labor. The great thing about capitalism is that we all specialize in something in our work lives. I'm a professor. You're all going to do something that you're going to specialize in your work lives, and you're going to make money doing that. And then you're going to use that money to buy goods, food, clothing, shelter, entertainment, everything you buy in life from other people who specialize in other things. Just think how horribly difficult it would be if you had to try to do it on your own and build your own house, make your own clothes, grow your own food. We'd all live like prehistoric animals if we try to do that. Some governments have very stupidly attempted to do this by practicing what is called autarky. This is probably a word you've never heard of, but it's an attempt by a whole country to be self-sufficient in everything. Germany did this in the 1930s. Their economic policy was autarky, and the Germans found out that they didn't have enough resources to be self-sufficient in everything. And so they decided to try to do this. They had to invade and conquer their neighbors and steal their property to try to be self-sufficient in everything, autarky. So rather than relying on peaceful exchange and trade in the market, they attempted conquest. And that brings us to another benefit of capitalistic markets, when people do business with other people, when you're making money by cooperating with other people from other countries, you're not in favor of anybody killing them, are you? Why would you want to go to war with somebody who you're doing business with and you're prospering with? And so, in other words, free trade or free exchange around the world among people in different countries is conducive to peace. It doesn't guarantee peace, but it increases the likelihood that we'll have peace if people can peacefully cooperate and do business with each other and trade each other. You get to know people from other cultures, you get to make friends with people from other cultures, and it drops that whole, the whole suspicion thing that people often have when there are people of other cultures that they don't know, they don't understand, it's foreign to them, sometimes frightening to them. That all disappears pretty easily when you do business with other people and other cultures. And so there's an old saying among economists, some economists, it's been around since the 19th century, that is credited with a French economist named Frédéric Bastiat. I'll write that name down for you. I don't know if you can see it from way back there, Bastiat. He coined the phrase, "If goods can't cross borders, armies will." So back in his day, it was well understood by people that restrictions on capitalism, restrictions on trade between countries especially, often led to war. Because if people could not feed themselves by trading with other people and from other countries, they're backed into a corner sometimes. And what are they going to do? Well, they go to war sometimes. It's certainly not a guarantee, but historically that has happened in many instances. That's why Frédéric Bastiat, back in the mid-19th century, coined this phrase, "If goods cannot cross borders, armies will." So these are some of the characteristics of capitalism. And capitalism is always something that has been geared towards satisfying the masses. As I said when I mentioned Shark Tank, the television show Shark Tank, the big question they always ask is, how can we scale this business? That is, how can we sell it to as many people as possible? Well, how are you going to do that? How do you sell something to as many people as possible? Well, you have to make it cheap enough so that everybody can buy it. That's what you have to do. And so I brought in a quote from an economist named Joseph Schumpeter, who Professor DeRosa tells me he had some of his students, I don't know if it's you guys, that he had, is it your class, they had read some of Schumpeter? He was famous 20th century economist. He died, I think, in 1950. He wrote this famous book called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Maybe that's what he had you read part of. He said this, "The capitalist engine is first and last, an engine of mass production, which unavoidably also means production for the masses. It is the cheap cloth, the cheap cotton and rayon fabric, boots, motor cars, and so on that are the typical achievements of capitalist production and not improvements that would mean much to the rich man." John D. Rockefeller, back in the 19th century, when he became the richest man in the world, how did he do it? He did it by reducing the price of refined petroleum from 30 cents a gallon in 1869 to 8 cents a gallon in 1885. That's how he did it. He made it very, very cheap for everybody to heat and light their homes with kerosene and other products. That's really the bottom line of how John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world. And I could stand here and tell you 100 stories like that of some of the famous entrepreneurs, as we call them, in history, who became very, very wealthy themselves by doing just that, by pleasing the masses. And of course, the masses are always in charge. We see, when we look at business, we see the corporate chief executive officers and the banks, and it seems like they're in charge, like they're in control, because they do make the decisions regarding what's going to be produced, who gets hired, what the products are going to look like, who gets the loan for their business, and so forth. So it seems like these fat cats are in charge, doesn't it? But really, you and I are in charge. You and I, as the consumers, are ultimately in charge. And I have another quote that I brought in. This is probably the last kind of a longish quote, but this is from an economist named Ludwig von Mises. I'll write that name down. He was an Austrian. He was very famous in his day. I could tell you a good story about Mises, but I won't. But he wrote this book called Human Action, and here's what he said about the consumer, the role of the consumer in the economy, you and me. And so this is describing you right here, what I'm going to read. Consumers make poor people rich and rich people poor. They determine precisely what should be produced, in what quantity, and in what qualities. They are egoistic bosses, full of whims and fancies, changeable and unpredictable. They do not care a whit for past merit and vested interests. In their capacities as buyers and consumers, they are hard-hearted and callous, without consideration for other people. So look in the mirror, that's who he's talking about, hard-hearted and callous. In other words, make me a better deal and I'll take it. For example, how many of you use Uber instead of taxi cabs? Or how many of you drive for Uber? That's what he's talking about. Uber came along and offered a cheaper alternative to the taxi cabs and employment opportunities for a lot of people. And now today there are more Uber drivers in New York City than there are taxi cabs. Even though every time I've ever been in New York City, it seemed like there are more taxi cabs than people in Manhattan, but there are now more Uber drivers. So this is what Mises is talking about, that anybody that can offer us a better deal will dump the old business we've been buying from on a dime, and that's how you and I, as consumers, are really in charge. All the big shots may seem like they're in charge, but they can go out of business tomorrow if we decide we're not going to cater to them. We're not going to buy their product. Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, or one of them, I don't know, every other year, he's either the richest or the second richest or wealthiest or whatever. He can't force you or me to do anything. I can tell Bill Gates, the wealthiest man in the world, go play in the traffic on A1A, Bill Gates. I'm using an Apple computer. I'm not going to use a Microsoft computer. Okay, I can't say that to the government. I can't tell the IRS, go play the traffic. They'll send guys with guns to put me in jail if I don't pay their taxes. But Bill Gates, if I refuse to pay him anything, he can do nothing to me. Okay, and if enough of us refuse to buy his products, he'll lose billions of dollars. Okay, it's important to distinguish between what I call real entrepreneurship and political entrepreneurship. A lot of people are confused about capitalism. They see things like the bailouts of the big banks. You know, after all these big banks made horribly bad decisions on mortgage loans, and the government came around with tens of billions of dollars in bailouts. That's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism or mercantilism. Capitalism is a profit and loss system. Okay, if you're in business and you do well serving the customers, you earn a profit, it's yours. If you do poorly and you lose money, the loss is yours too. It is not I keep the profit, the taxpayers pay for my losses system. That's called socializing the losses. The losses are socialized. That's not capitalism. That's the type of thing Adam Smith critiqued in his book In Defense of Capitalism. That's mercantilism. It always has been. And I'll give you one great example in history. I've written in one of my books, How Capitalism Saved America is the name of the book. I wrote about some of the so-called robber barons of the 19th century. And the building of the transcontinental railroads is a very interesting story because you had several big government-subsidized transcontinental railroads, which is not capitalism because it's government-subsidized. Okay, and then you had one man named James J. Hill who built a privately funded railroad, and he did not even use land grants. The U.S. government gave millions and millions of dollars worth of land to railroad corporations in the beginning, right after the American Civil War, but James J. Hill paid for right-of-way in the land. Even when he got into Indian territory in the West, he would pay with cattle or money or whatever the Indians wanted to trade for rights of way through their what they considered to be their land, which they had lived on for generations. Whereas the government subsidized railroads would just call the army in and get rid of the Indians in that way and make way for the building of the railroads. Well, it turns out that James J. Hill was a real capitalist, a real entrepreneur, and he built the most efficiently built and most profitable transcontinental railroad anywhere in the United States. And one of his biographers that I quote said that it was the most profitable railroad in the world at the time. in his heyday. Whereas the government-subsidized railroads were a mess. They were bankrupt as soon as they finished them, and because of politics. I'm going to draw a quick map of the United States here, or a Turkey, one or the other. It's the United States. The government-subsidized transcontinental railroads were very different from James J. Hill's. I don't know if you can see this. James J. Hill started in Minnesota, and he tried to find the shortest route to the West Coast through the Rocky Mountains. He actually hired an engineer who there was a famous pass through the Rockies that was discovered by Lewis and Clark in 1803, and no one had found it since Lewis and Clark did. James J. Hill hired an engineer who found it, and it knocked off 100 miles from his route. And so he was the kind of person that left no stone unturned in terms of reducing his costs, making money. And so his route looked kind of like that, okay? Whereas the government-subsidized railroads started up in Council Bluffs, Iowa, they look more like this, with all these appendages. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the reason why they looked like that, like a bowl of spaghetti, was that they had to buy the votes from every member of Congress from these areas for the subsidies to the railroads. And so if you had a congressman who lived in the middle of nowhere in a town of 50 people, he would say, well, you need to run a railroad line to my town if you want my vote for the subsidies. Okay, we'll run a line to your town for the subsidies. And so after a while, there got to be so many of these that the line did look like a big bowl of spaghetti. And it was like, if you were to try to figure out the most inefficient way to get people from the Midwest and products and grain and things like that to the West Coast, you would probably pick the map. You can go online and find the map of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads, and it looks like that. And so they were grossly inefficient, but these were political entrepreneurs. So there's James J. Hill, the real entrepreneur, doing everything he can to help the people along the way. He would subsidize the farmers along the way, he would give them cattle. He would give them free seeds. He would bring in experts on agriculture because he understood that if the farmers along his route did not prosper, neither would his railroad prosper. So he wasn't doing it because he was like a Mother Teresa, charitable. He was doing it because he wanted to succeed in his business. Whereas, on the other hand, the political entrepreneurs, they spent a lot of their time whining and dining congressmen and senators. They would bring them on train rides out west and have them shoot the buffalo and give them booze and food and basically bribe them for subsidies. And they were built so inefficiently that I quoted one passage about the building of the government-subsidized transcontinental railroads. They literally built a railroad line on top of 10 feet of ice in the Rocky Mountains. And then when the spring thaw came, the ice melted and the thing collapsed. But that was all good because they got paid in a per mile subsidy. So the more miles of railroad line you build, the more money you got from the government. And so it created this perverse incentive whereby they didn't really care that much about this. And the whole thing blew up, and there was a famous scandal called the Crédit Mobilier scandal in 1873 that was, the whole thing was rife with fraud. That's the type of thing that Adam Smith warned against, political entrepreneurship. That's also the kind of thing that a lot of people confuse with real capitalism. You want to be for real capitalism. That's the thing that benefits us. But the people who rant and rave against the one percenters, well, there are good one percenters and bad one percenters. The good one percenters are the ones who invent great products and find ways to give us things cheaper and do that. The bad one percenters are the politically connected ones that made their money through government-sanctioned monopoly franchises and protectionist tariffs and government-imposed blockages on competition, that sort of thing. And so if you're going to complain about the so-called one percenters, that's the category to complain about. Okay, so what capitalism is not is government bailouts, corporate welfare, as we call it, subsidies, protectionism, tariffs, and I would add central planning by the Federal Reserve Board. When the Fed, the so-called Fed, engages in what it calls monetary policy, when it wants to increase the supply of money in the economy, it does it mostly through Wall Street. That's why the New York Fed is the most prominent. It's always the most important Fed, where the government, the Fed will send money to Wall Street in return for bonds. So it puts more money in circulation in that way. And so the Wall Street investment banks like Goldman Sachs are the first to get their hands on all this money. And they can do a lot of things with that. They can make a lot of money on this cash that they get in their hands before the rest of us. But then that money is spent somewhere and is spent again and is spent again and is spent again through the multiplier process that we talk about in economics. And that, of course, drives up prices usually. It usually drives up prices. If it doesn't drive up prices, it creates boom and bust cycles in the economy is what it does. And so by the time you and I see any of this, the benefits of this cheap credit, either prices have been driven up or there's a new bubble created in the economy. And so the Fed really is a form of veiled corporate welfare in a lot of ways, because the recipients, the main beneficiaries, are people like the investment banks who have a very close symbiotic relationship with the Fed and the controllers of the money supply. And let me give you an example of how this is an old truth that has been known for a long, long time. There was a precursor to the Fed. It was called the Bank of the United States. And the first one was in the 1790s. It lasted for 20 years. And then it was resurrected after the War of 1812. It was called the Second Bank of the United States. So we had a central bank before the Fed. The Fed came along in the year 1913, and we've had it ever since. But President Andrew Jackson was opposed to this Bank of the United States because he thought it destabilized the economy and it was politically corrupting. And so the Bank of the United States had a 20-year charter, and when the 20-year charter was up in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson opposed it as he vetoed the rechartering bill of the Bank of the United States. And I'm going to read to you one of the things that he said in his bill. You can go online if those of you who are anybody's interested in this and just Google Andrew Jackson veto message of Bank of the United States. You'll find it. But near the end, he says this as his justification. So he's announcing his justification for abolishing the central bank. Okay, hold your applause, please. He said, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. Every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, the mechanics, the laborers, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government." So he was saying that the precursor to the Fed was a funding source for these injustices, for these enriching the rich at the expense of everybody else. And so economists like myself are not the first ones to be critical of the Fed like this. The next question I want to pose here is that did capitalism cause the Great Recession of 2008? And I have a bunch of quotes of people saying that, but I'm just going to read one of them from the New York Times at the time. It said, "The mortgage crisis is laissez-faire gone wrong." And if you go online and Google, Google around about causes of the Great Recession, you'll find a lot of quotes like this from a lot of pretty important people saying things like, even the president of France. I had a quote from the president of France saying essentially the same thing about this. So there were other people who were saying that, well, Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Fed, prior to the crash, as a young man, he was a protege of Ayn Rand, the novelist, and Ayn Rand was in favor of capitalism. Therefore, the Greenspan Fed must have been a laissez-faire Fed that didn't regulate financial markets, looked the other way and all that, and that's all false. But there are a lot of prominent people who have been repeating that, the idea that we had this free market out there with no regulation, and that's what caused the crash. Or a closely related theory that you see is that greed caused this, Wall Street greed. For that to be true, you'd have to assume that there was no greed in Wall Street in the year 2007. and it just popped up all of a sudden in 2008 and caused this problem. Or there was greed, but there was somehow a vast expansion of greed all of a sudden. And that sounds kind of fishy to me. I don't know about you. I think, there's no reason to believe that Wall Street bankers were ever more greedy or less greedy in that year. But it's just not true that we had or have anything near a laissez-faire economy or a really capitalist economy. Let me give you some facts about the actual economy. Government spending at all levels takes up about 40% of national income. So the U.S. economy is about at least 40% socialized. That's not counting things like loan guarantees, of which there are hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and regulations that essentially put governments in control of a lot of businesses for a lot of part of the year. There are 15 cabinet-level departments involved in government planning of the economy, one way or the other. Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, so forth. There are over 100 federal regulatory agencies and commissions. There's a giant book called the Federal Register that's a listing of all federal government regulations, and it's 75,000 pages long in small print the last time I saw it. How on earth could you call that laissez-faire? 75,000 of pages of regulations. On top of that, there are hundreds of state and local government regulatory agencies in the United States. If you look up the Wikipedia list of czars in the United States, the last Russian dictator who wasn't a communist was called a czar. Czar. We have a lot of czars in the United States. And this has been going on for quite a long time. President Obama appointed 38 of them. President Bush II, appointed 33 of them. And so every president that comes along wants new czars. We have over 100 federal czars who are presidential appointees who are often given tremendous regulatory powers, but they're unaccountable to who? They're not elected to anybody. They're not by anybody. Hardly anybody knows who they are. But they use the powers of government that have accumulated over more than 200 years in Washington, D.C. to control in various ways the business world and other parts and your life, not just the business world. How many of you knew that we had an Asian carp czar? Honest to God, look it up on Wikipedia, Asian carp czar, an automobile czar, a bank bailout czar, a bird flu czar, climate, drug, energy, food, green jobs czar, housing czar, manufacturing czar, price czar, technology, and a weatherization czar. There's 100 of them on the list, okay? And so it's hard to imagine that we have a laissez-faire economy, a free economy with 75,000 pages of regulation. We have pockets of real capitalism is what we have. And every once in a while, enough people ignore all these government controls and government regulators and succeed despite all of this. And as far as the crash of '08, I would argue that the real culprit was the Fed, which created the real estate bubble in the first place with its pursuit of zero interest rates, which of course led to an explosion in housing prices. Eventually, that's what caused the bubble, and the bubble burst. That's what the Fed has been doing for over 100 years now, is creating what we call boom and bust cycles. And that was the boom. The boom this time was in real estate. In the year 2000, it was in the stock market. I used to have on my office door at work a quote from Paul Krugman in the New York Times in 2001 saying, "Now that the stock market bubble has burst, the Fed really should create a real estate bubble." He actually said that, and they did. They took it. I don't know if they literally took his advice, but that was his advice in 2001 in the New York Times. Let's create a bubble in real estate. How'd that work out, Paul? Not so good. Okay, and that was the real cause of the crash. So what has capitalism done for us anyway? The title of my talk is Why America Needs More. Well, what has it really done for us? Well, it has enriched the working class. It has always enriched the working class from the very beginning when people started leaving the farms and working in factories. And you read stories about how dismal the factories were, which they were. And they still are. It's still not the nicest job to have. Well, these people voluntarily left the farms, didn't they? Nobody forced them to leave the farms. And life on the farm wasn't that great anyway. 16 hours of back-breaking farm labor in the hot sun is not an ideal job. And bringing your children with you out in the fields in 12, 14, 16 hours a day, child labor, that was not the nicest situation to be in, was it? And so these people decided on their own that as dirty and dangerous as the factories were, they were paying more. They were paying more, and it was better than the farms. And so that's what they did. So their lives were improved by their own judgment when they moved from the farms to the factories at the beginning of capitalism. And then what happened next was that capitalism became more and more productive. As capitalists invested in more and more machinery and technology, the labor force became more productive because it had better tools to work with, better machinery, better equipment to work with. And as workers became more productive, the capitalists had to compete for their labors. And how do you compete for people? If you're in business and you have a successful business and you need more people to work for you, how do you get them to come to leave what they're doing and work for you? Well, you have to offer them more money. That's what you have to do. And so the rise in wages over time was mainly fueled by capital investment and technology by the capitalists, which increased the productivity of the workers. And then the employers did not necessarily want to pay them more, but competition forced them to pay them more if they wanted to survive, if they wanted to compete with other businesses. Okay, and so eventually, people made enough money that they no longer had to keep their children with them. Child labor began to disappear. No mother wants to bring her kids out of school and put them to work in a factory. But the alternative would have been perhaps hunger, starvation, the death of the new infant, that sort of thing. That was the alternative. The alternative wasn't getting a high-paying job at Starbucks or at the mall. The alternative was very bleak, which is still true in parts of the world today, where the alternatives to working in a Nike factory in somewhere in Indonesia or somewhere might be begging on the street or prostitution or something much worse than working in a factory. And that was the American situation in early America and everywhere else in the early days. And so capitalism gave us higher wages, lower prices by producing more stuff, and more and better goods. And I have a quote from two Federal Reserve economists from the Dallas Fed, Michael Cox and Richard Alm. I'm going to read to you to put this into perspective. To put this into perspective, they say a 19th century millionaire couldn't grab a cold drink from the refrigerator. He couldn't hop into a smooth-riding automobile for a 70-mile-an-hour trip down an interstate highway to the mountains or seashore. He couldn't call up news, movies, music, and sporting events by simply touching the remote controls buttons. Couldn't jet north to Toronto, south to Cancun, east to Boston, or west to San Francisco in just a few hours. He couldn't transmit documents to Europe, Asia, or any place else in seconds. So you get the idea. The things that we all just take for granted today that have been produced for us by capitalism, millionaires in the 19th century had no access to at all. The average middle-class American today lives much better than the kings and queens of Europe did not that long ago. Okay, capitalism also provided us with a shorter work week. As workers become more productive, they're making more money, but working fewer hours. How can you make more money by working fewer hours? Well, the other way to do that is if you are more productive, and as a result, you can produce more per hour. And if you can produce more per hour, you're worth more to the employer, and you get paid more per hour. That's the only way that can happen. And so both the shorter work week and the elimination of child labor were well underway long before governments passed any laws regarding maximum hours and the elimination of child labor. The laws that were passed just codified what had been going on for decades, thanks to markets, thanks to competition in capitalist markets. Okay, capitalism also increases job safety. If you have an unsafe workplace, you have to pay people a premium. It's called a compensating difference to get them to work in an unsafe workplace. And so there's a profit incentive to a business person in making their workplace safer, because if you make it safer, you no longer have to pay such a premium to get people to work for you. Okay, people, we have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that is supposed to make the workplace safer, and they probably, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the profit motive also makes the workplace safer, because a dangerous workplace is costly to the employer. And everybody understands that businesses are in it to make the money, okay? The next question I thought I'd pose to you was, maybe I'm taking a question that some of you might have, but didn't capitalism cause the Great Depression in the 1930s? It wasn't that the great failure of capitalism? And you're probably guessing that my answer would be no, it did not. There was another bubble, another monetary bubble in the late 1920s with credit expansion, and that bubble burst, and it was a bubble in the stock market, and it was a stock market crash in 1929, the famous crash. But that wasn't a Great Depression; it was just the bursting of the stock market bubble. The government responded for the first time in American history with massive government intervention. Prior to that, the American way of dealing with recessions, which used to be called panics, the way of dealing with that was retrenchment, cutting taxes, cutting spending, free trade, lower tariffs. That was always the American way of dealing with a recession. But this was the first time ever that there was massive government intervention. It began with Herbert Hoover. It didn't begin with Franklin Roosevelt. What did Hoover do? He had public works spending that was 13% of the federal budget. When President Obama came in after the Great Recession of 2008, and he started up his version of public works programs, they only accounted for about 6% of the federal budget at the time. You might remember all his talk about shovel-ready programs and all that sort of thing. So Herbert Hoover was twice the spender as President Obama was at the outset of his recession. There were enormous tax increases to pay for all this. And this, of course, took money out of the pockets of consumers. Is that a smart thing to do when people are standing in soup lines and unemployment is 25%? Take money out of the pockets of the taxpayers? Hoover was the one who started the business of paying farmers for not growing food. They thought this would reduce the supply of food and therefore raise the price of food, which would raise farmers' incomes. Is that a smart thing to do when people are standing in food lines and starving to death, literally, in the Mississippi Delta to make food more expensive? Herbert Hoover started that. He signed the Smoot-Hawley tariff that started an international trade war, and international trade shrunk by 2/3 around the world in 3 years, from 1929 on. That was a dumb thing. He put the government in control of credit allocation with something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And so Herbert Hoover started all this massive government intervention before Roosevelt even came in, which is why Franklin Roosevelt's top economic advisor, Rexford Tugwell, said this about Hoover. This is Rexford Tugwell. He was an economist at Columbia University. He was Franklin Roosevelt's top domestic advisor from 1933 to 1945. He said this, as a quote, "The ideas embodied in the New Deal legislation were a compilation of those which had come to maturity under President Hoover's aegis. We all of us owed much to Hoover," which is true. FDR, the so-called New Deal, pretty much codified a lot of the things that Hoover started, which of course didn't work. They didn't work. The Great Depression did occur, didn't it? And a lot of it occurred because of the Fed and because of what Hoover did. And of course, FDR never did end the Great Depression. In 1929, the unemployment rate in the United States was 2.9%, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. 10 years later, 1939, after the whole so-called New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, the unemployment rate, was 17.2%. 17%. Almost 6 times higher than it was at the beginning of the Great Depression. So despite all the public works programs, the taxes, and everything else, Roosevelt employed over 10 million people in government public works programs. The unemployment rate in 1939, according to the government, was 17.2%. It never did end. And then World War II came, and one of the popular myths that's out there is that World War II finally ended the Great Depression. But that's a myth. For example, we have a lot of unemployed people today. If our government today got 10 million unemployed people and shipped them off to the Middle East and put guns in their hands, yeah, unemployment would go down. The next president would be able to brag the unemployment rate is 1% or something like that, because we just shipped all these people out of the country. That's what happened in World War II. 11 million men were drafted, and millions more joined the military to avoid being drafted, because if you were drafted, you were much more likely to be on the front lines in combat. But if you joined voluntarily, you were more likely to get a job that was a little safer in World War II. And so, yeah, you ship millions of men out of the country, unemployment's going to go down. But sitting in a foxhole with bombs dropping on you is not the same lifestyle as being at home with your family at dinner time, is it? That's a real reduction in unemployment when a man has a job and can go home at night and live a normal life. That's not what happened in World War II. So yeah, unemployment disappeared, but the Great Depression didn't end. The standard of living during the war was actually worse for most Americans because there was rationing of everything. So many resources were devoted to the war effort that, the consumer economy suffered even more. What finally ended the Great Depression, what finally ended it, was the demobilization of the Army after World War II. That was a big thing, big reason, not the only reason. But when the war ended, the federal government budget fell from $95 billion to $35 billion. So it's about a 2/3 reduction in absolute numbers of government spending between 1945 and 1948. 1946, the year 1946, was the biggest year of private sector economic growth in American history by far. 30% growth in private consumption and investment spending in 1 year. A big dive in government spending, so that the so-called Keynesian economists like Paul Krugman, they miscount this. They'll say, yeah, we've got a 30% growth in the production of goods and services and investment, but then you have a big cutback in government spending. Well, what counts here? How was all the military spending part of the economy? That was in Europe and Asia, as far as that goes. But the real economy, the production of consumer goods and the investment in factories and putting people back to work, that grew by 30% in 1 year in 1946. And the main reason was, I'll give you two main reasons. One, the massive reduction in government spending, just the opposite of what the so-called Keynesian economists were predicting would happen. They were predicting the Great Depression would be even worse as a result of that, and they were dead wrong about that. But also, all during the Roosevelt administration, people in the administration had very anti-business rhetoric, and there was a constant threat of higher taxes, more regulations, even confiscation of factories and property, which did occur during the war. And so there was a fear of that. But once Roosevelt was gone and Truman was in there, Truman was not at all like that. And so there was no more this constant uncertainty about what is the government going to do next. Economists call this regime uncertainty. And so that was gone, that disappeared. So business people felt much more confident to invest finally since 1929. They found more confident to invest, and they did. And that's really what got the United States out of the Great Depression. In other words, there was a big burst of capitalism, finally. The government reacted to the crash of '29 with an attack on capitalism that was unprecedented, never matched anywhere in American history, with layers and layers of taxes and regulations. And they finally cooled it a bit after the war. And that's what finally ended the Great Depression, the economic misery of the Great Depression at that time. Okay, and so this is why we need more capitalism more than ever. I'm looking at a room full of mostly college students. You're young, You want to have economic prospects in your future. You want jobs. You want to raise families, buy houses, and do all the things that everybody else does. Well, a lot of it hinges on the strength of this economy, doesn't it? Your ability to get a job when you graduate. Some of you may be graduating next month. It hinges on the health of the economy. And the direction we've been heading in, I would argue, is not the best direction in that. And we need another dose of what happened at the end of World War II in a big move more in the direction of more reliance on markets and less on politics. More real entrepreneurship, more Shark Tank entrepreneurs, and fewer Washington, D.C. political entrepreneurs, in other words, is what we need. And maybe I'll shut up at that point. I see some people, even in the front row, are starting to squirm a little bit. It might be bathroom time, I don't know. But that's my story for now, and I'm sticking to it. And I guess we'll have time for a few questions.
Okay, Tom, if you want any questions from the front row.
What would you say to someone who says that our capitalist system is broken and that the only way to move forward would be socialism?
His question was, what would I say to somebody who said our capitalist system is broken and the only way to move forward is socialism? Well, nothing is perfect. No one ever argued that capitalism or anything else is perfect. And I would say also, read my new book that comes out on July 18th called The Problem with Socialism. I just wrote a 16-chapter book that is coming out. Your generation apparently is not that well educated on the realities of what socialism is. You hear politicians say, apparently a lot of your generation believes in Santa Claus still. I mean, you look way too old to believe in Santa Claus. But when you hear politicians say free education, free food, what's free? Free health care. Do the nurses and doctors work for free? I don't think so. And I know quite a few doctors, and I guarantee you they don't work for free. I pay them all dearly every time I go to one of them. But the same with me. I don't know about Professor DeRosa, but I don't work for free. I'm a college professor, so how could it be free? And so if you learn just a little bit about economics, you will understand the fallacies of socialism, because your generation, I think, the Cold War ended a long time ago, and you didn't maybe learn much about why socialism always was an inherently failed system, no matter how you define it. And so, which is why it collapsed all around the world in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And neither does Scandinavian socialism work very good, too. The only reason why Sweden has become a little bit better in recent years, and Denmark maybe a little bit too, is that they've abandoned some of their socialism. They've privatized some of the healthcare. And Sweden has gone a long way toward privatizing healthcare especially. But Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, for example, became wealthy because of entrepreneurship in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite, was a Swedish entrepreneur, is a good example of that. They had many famous, worldwide famous entrepreneurs from Scandinavia, and they built up this great wealth. And then the socialists came in and took over the government, and they've basically been eating up their wealth ever since, and they've created quite a few catastrophes. Sweden had 500% inflation, or not inflation, interest rates. Not too long ago, not inflation, but interest rates, 500%. So it's not quite the wonderland that someone like Bernie Sanders would make it out to be, as far as that goes. And just remember, there's the title of my book is The Problem with Socialism, and it comes from a quote from Margaret Thatcher that said, "The problem with socialism is you eventually run out of other people's money." That's the big problem with it.
Basically, my question would be, is there a way to combat stuff like that without removing the motivation provided by capitalism?
Well, your question is, somebody said there's millions of children who live...
For example, my question is, there are certain groups that are impoverished through no fault of their own.
Yeah.
You can't tell a child to go out and work to provide for themselves. Can you
he's talking about child poverty. Well, there's nothing in human history that has done a better job at eradicating child poverty than capitalism. That's what creates the wealth and the income that we use not only for jobs for parents, but for charities. Whenever our economy is growing, there's, in this country, especially in America especially, we're very generous people in general. Not all of us. Some of us are pretty darn stingy, but Americans are pretty generous. Look at all the charities we have, and all the billions and billions of dollars are donated to all sorts of causes, from the local symphony to the American Cancer Society to everything. And so where does that money come from? Well, it has to come from markets. It has to come from business and exchange and the creation of wealth by capitalism. And I would also argue that just in general for charity, the most effective programs for charity have always been the private programs. For example, in my book on socialism that's coming out, I have a small section on the Mormons. The Mormons' system of charity is, if you're a Mormon, you're taken care of. If you lose your job, you're on hard times, they'll give you food, shelter, clothing, you're taken care of you. But you have to be working toward getting a job, educating yourself, learning a skill, staying away from alcohol, and misbehaving. As long as you're doing that, they'll do whatever it takes to help you, and it works. Whereas with the government welfare system, they send you a check, and there's really, and it doesn't always work. Or they'll put you in public housing, and which is not always the nicest place. In Baltimore, where I work, in the public housing projects, they shoot at the cops when the cops show up. And so who would want to live in a place like that? But that's Baltimore. It's probably not, I don't know if that exists down here, but it's like that in some American cities. And so I would argue that the most effective way to deal with these problems has always been the churches, the synagogues, the private charities. They're the people who are there in the communities and can make the best use of the wealth created by capitalism to take care of these things. I also write in this book that one of the sad effects of the welfare state is that it inculcates in people's minds the idea that I don't have to help my neighbors because the government will do it. I don't have to educate my own children, the government will do it. I don't have to worry about my parents or grandparents in their old age. The government's going to take care of them. That type of attitude has been created by the welfare state. So a lot of private efforts that used to take place where we were more concerned about our neighbors who were having hard times, whose kids needed food and so forth, people ignore this now. Not everybody. We have a lot of good people who don't ignore that, but it has had that effect. There's a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion by Marvin Olasky that goes through the history of how Americans thought of the idea of compassion. It used to mean self-sacrifice for the benefit of somebody else. Now it means, do you vote for the biggest spender running for president? That's pretty much, that's compassion today. And they're not at all the same things.
Let's take one more question from the front row, and then we'll open it up. We have about 5 more minutes.
Income inequality has become a major concern during this year's election, and I was wondering, well, what's your personal opinion on it? Would you consider the growing inequality a problem for this country, and why or why not?
Well, he's asking me about the growing inequality. All my lifetime, I've heard people talk about the growing inequality, but I'm not sure it's growing. It might be. Let's see, I had a quote I wanted to share with you if I could find the page number here. Well, like I said at the beginning of my talk, the type of, the people who complain about the one percenters, the ones like the Wall Streeters who are connected with government, like when's the last time we had a Treasury Secretary who was not from Goldman Sachs? Why is that? There's nobody else in the world. It's because they have this relationship, especially with Goldman Sachs, that they got bailed out. The former, under Bush, the chairman of Goldman Sachs went to work for Bush to become Treasury Secretary, and then they gave Goldman Sachs government money worth, $20 billion, I forget the exact amount, and then he leaves and goes back to Goldman Sachs. And I remember reading in the New York Times, his wife went out and bought herself another $5 million house. That's corruption stinking to high heaven, isn't it? So that type of inequality, when you see people like that, and then unemployment going up to 8 or 10%, that's the sort of thing you should protest, but it's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism, mercantilism. It's the thing people like me have been criticizing my whole career as the type of thing we need to get rid of. And as far as inequality, it's a tricky thing. I want to quote There was a study done by the Federal Reserve Board of Dallas on this inequality. And they look at these statistics that show like the bottom 20% of income earners and pretty much appear to be stuck there. They're stuck in the bottom 20%. But they relied on, there's a survey done by the University of Michigan of 50,000 Americans that they tracked since 1968. So these are actual individuals and families. They track their, it's a wide socioeconomically diverse group. How have they done economically since that time, since the late 1960s? And here's what they found. Only 5% of the families in the bottom fifth of the income distribution in 1975 were still there in 1991. More than 3/4 of them had made their way up to the two highest income quintiles. So there's always new people at that bottom, at the bottom quintile of the earning scale. But it's not the same people. There's a lot of mobility in American society still. And if we had even more capitalism and less socialism, there'd be even more mobility, more opportunity. That's what we need, more opportunity, more jobs, more businesses. We don't need more socialism. They said this also, the poorest families made the largest gains. Those who started in the bottom 20% of income earners in 1975 had an inflation-adjusted gain in annual income of $27,745 by 1991. Those who started in the top 20% in 1975 also improved, but only by $4,354. So yeah, the rich got richer by a little bit, if you call that rich, the top 20%. But the poor, so-called the poor, they got richer like 5 times faster during that time. And so these statistics on growing inequality are very tricky. You know, you shouldn't take that as a given. If someone tells you there's growing inequality, you should challenge them and ask them for proof. And they may have proof. You know, they may convince you, but don't just accept it on face value because it's a sort of an easy slogan to sort of just accept on the face of it. But it's not necessarily true. Okay.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned a few times that we need more capitalism, but capitalism created like the expansion of the consumerism, which then created the depletion of resources. So how would you go about fixing that? With more capitalism or more regulation?
Well, the depletion of resources, environmental problems. Well, you know, the history of that is there's a book by a Harvard law professor named Morton Horwitz. No, there's no O in there, Horwitz. And it's called The Transformation of American Law. And the theme of this book is that with regard to the environment, up until the late 19th century, we had a pretty strong liability law system so that if somebody opened up a factory and they polluted a stream nearby and that inflicted a harm on the property values or the health of people downstream, it was almost a perfect certainty that if those people sued, they would win and the factory owner would have to pay. So that's called internalizing the externality in the lingo of economics. You're forcing people to pay. And so people were more careful about pollution because there was a price attached to it. But then Professor Horwitz at Harvard Law School wrote that the law changed because the law schools became imbibed a sort of a socialistic or collectivistic attitude where the argument was made that no small group of people should stand in the way of the greater good. And the greater good was economic progress at that time. And so the law changed to pretty much rationalize or justify letting polluters off the hook. And so it's not inherent in capitalism that we have pollution. If we have sound liability laws, which we don't, we have liability laws, but they've changed a lot over time, then it would be better. And also, the main cause of a lot of environmental problems is government ownership of land. Some of the worst environmental disasters are in the national parks and in national lands, the commons, where nobody owns it. It's the absence of property rights causes a lot of problems. I wrote about this with the worldwide collapse of socialism in the late 80s and early 90s. For the first time, people could take a look at what was going on in these countries in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union and these places. And you could go online and read my article. It's called Why Socialism Causes Pollution. And because the theory that capitalism causes pollution would tell you that in countries that outlawed capitalism for 40, 50, 70 years, they shouldn't have these problems, should they? The environment should be pretty good shape. But then what the world learned at the end when socialism collapsed in all these places was that these were environmental cesspools. There's even a book written called Ecocide in the USSR. We had things like Lake Baikal in Russia, the largest freshwater lake in the world. I quoted a UN report that said that there were islands of untreated sewage 5 miles long and 3 miles wide floating on the lake. In Krakow, Poland, they had water cannons spraying water in the streets during the daytime to knock the lead dust out of the air. And if you had lung disease in Poland in those days, they put you in underground uranium mines where they had lung clinics. So you might have had clean air, but being near uranium might not have been the safest thing either. But they pretty much put you there to die. And so it was just a catastrophe. The Volga River, the steamboats on the Volga River had signs saying, "Don't throw the cigarettes overboard, they may catch the river on fire," because there were so many chemicals dumped in the river. And we had some problems in the United States like that. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and the Clarion River was about the color of this guy's green shirt here in those days. And they actually had the river, Clarion River caught fire in the 1960s for the same reason. It was polluted. And so I would argue that capitalism is not necessarily the root cause of pollution if we have sound liability laws. And I would recommend to you, there's a great book called Free Market Environmentalism for the Next Generation. There's a group of friends of mine in Montana, they used to teach at Montana State University, who call themselves free market environmentalists. And they spent the past 30 years working on private voluntary solutions to all kinds of environmental problems because governments often fail at it. They often do a bad job at it like they do at everything else. After all, why would you put the same bozos who are in charge of the federal budget in charge of the environment? Why would anybody think they're going to do a good job with the environment when they do such a horrible job with everything else that they run? Or all these wars that they run, that they haven't won one since, when's the last one they won? The Civil War? I consider the Russians to have won World War II more than the Americans did, as far as that goes. So why would you do that? So,
We have time for one more question.
sure. I'll let
choose.
let's choose the guy way in the back, since we've been sort of front-end biased here.
Any government regulation in the private sector marketplace, so where do you draw that line?
Could you repeat that? I didn't.
Do you believe that there should be any government regulation in the private sector marketplace? And if so, where do you draw that line?
Oh, there's no way of drawing a line. Do I believe there'd be any government regulation? We have 75,000 pages of federal regulations now. And so, where do you draw the line? One of the things you should know about regulation is that government regulation of industry is not run by angels. It's not people with halos over their head. It's not people with a head the size of Albert Einstein and a halo, an angel's halo over it. It's politicians who run regulation. It's regulatory agencies, but the purse strings are controlled by politicians. And so in my book on socialism that's coming out, I have a chapter called How Regulation Benefits the One Percenters. And we have a long history in America of a lot of the major regulatory agencies that have been created. Well, they were always lobbied for by big business, because big business knows that smaller businesses often cannot afford the compliance cost. IBM can afford the compliance cost, but the startup may not be able to. And so regulation often causes barriers to competition out there. They don't create the public benefit that we all would like them to create all the time. The late George Stigler was an economist who taught at the University of Chicago, won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on what he calls the capture theory of regulation, of how so many of our regulatory agencies were captured by corporations that were supposed to be the ones being regulated. So it's sort of regulation for the benefit of the regulator. That's the reality of a lot of types of regulation. So you shouldn't. The premise of your question seems to be that if we had public interest regulation that actually worked, would be a good thing. But that's not the reality of how regulation actually works. And I suppose I could find some regulations that have really no effect on anybody that I would be okay with. But you know, I'm not against, you know, as long as if we have a government that protected life, liberty, and property, then whatever it has to do those things, in my view, is okay. It's, you know, and so but a lot of times with regulation, you destroy one person's property by giving a benefit to another person. Look at all the public utilities. All the public utilities were set up as government-sanctioned monopolies, you know, to the benefit of the shareholders and the managers of the public utilities at the expense of the utility customers. George Stigler, who I just mentioned, and in one of his first publications in this area, found that when public utility regulation came in the electric power industry, prices went up. They were supposed to go down, but they went up because they were cabinet. The first president of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was supposed to regulate the railroads for the benefit of the public, was a railroad industry president. You know, the Civil Aeronautics Board ran a cartel for the airline industry. There were more airlines in the 1930s than there were in the 1970s in the United States. They set the prices very high and made it illegal to compete by price. The Interstate Commerce Commission ran a cartel for the trucking industry for many years until it was abolished by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter abolished both of them with the help of Ralph Nader and Ted Kennedy, of all people. And so they learned the lesson that regulation is often just a scam that benefits one group at the expense of the rest. But I'm sure you could find some regulation somewhere that I would say is okay.
Okay,
To
thank
look
you
pretty
very
hard.
much, Dr.
Okay.
Neal.
You're welcome.
And